Welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on, well, I guess this is going to be on the internet, this video, but the audio is going to be on WVEW 107.7 FM LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. As you can see, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I have on Zoom with me the lovely Emily Kornheiser, as we are both sequestered in our abodes all alone during the time of COVID. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you, Olga. It's so nice to see you and talk to you.
It is nice to see you and talk to you. You know, I can be a little introverty and quite happy to have solitude, but I have to admit the recent solitude has been a little much.
I would think so. Yes, it has been for me too. I've definitely found tools around it. We can talk about that later, but it is an interesting change from life in the State House.
How are you feeling right now because what I'm coming across with in the community and also in my own reporting for the Commons, you know, how do we report and give people good information in a time of uncertainty when things are changing so rapidly? How are you dealing with that, both as an individual and as a legislator?
I'm struggling with it. I will be honest with you. I have some really good direct sources of information. The legislature, after some chaos, I don't really have a better word for it, where all of us were reaching out to the administration separately, to our contacts and our relationships and the people we usually went to for answers. And Kendall, who sort of handles all communications from legislators out of the governor's office, was overwhelmed while she was trying to do more important things or other important things. And so that communication between the legislature and the governor's office has been significantly streamlined. And so I feel like I have really reliable flow of information there. I have regular briefings through the Joint Rules Committee with sort of different pieces of the administration where I can get my specific questions answered for my constituents or for the policy I'm developing. And then I am on all of these regular community calls about rapid response things. And so I feel like I have these really reliable sources of information. I have this beautiful Google Doc that I am trying so hard to turn into a newsletter, but can't seem to find the minutes to sort of finish the writing on, because I'm on all these wonderful calls like this. But as I push information out through the channels I see, especially on Facebook, but other places too, even among sort of like email listservs with other legislators, there's so much misinformation out there. So much misinformation, and people are scared. We're all sort of peaked or elevated. And so the reaction time speeds up. We don't take a breath to sort of think if it's the right thing to share next. And so in all that chaos, it's really hard to take the time to read the thing carefully, to understand it before you answer the question or ask the next question. It's really hard to sort of, I found that earlier on, I was sharing information and sort of my lead sentence wouldn't be comprehensive enough because I was just trying to sort of send stuff out that people were misunderstanding what I was saying. And so I've been able to take a step back for the most part and sort of do that breathing once I recognized how much my role is to stay calm and centered and be a reliable source of understanding the information that's there rather than creating new information. But I have this incredible temptation to correct the misinformation when I see it. That's like, you know, I don't know if that's one of my best impulses under normal circumstances. It's certainly a quality that I see, like, one. Maybe it's like, you know, it's one of those things that like I see my son doing at dinner in a fairly like, you know, there are ways to do it kindly and there are ways to not do it kindly. And I just, you know, like I'm aware of that as a normal impulse within myself. And in these times, there's no way to win, right? I mean, and even, you know, like correcting misinformation on Facebook is a losing game under the best of circumstances because people want to believe what, you know, what feels safe and resonant for them in this moment, or what elevates them more because they are in sort of a tailspin that they are caught up in. And so I've really stepped back from trying to do sort of like one-on-one corrections, comments, um, seeding information in various places on sort of like groups on Facebook where I see it, because I don't have the capacity to track like the 15 hundreds of, comment threads that I could get myself caught up in. And that doesn't feel like it's safe or helpful for anyone. So I'm trying to stay in my lane, make sure that people know where I am and that they can come to me if they want interpretation of sort of things that are coming down. And that's where I am staying. And when people have reached out to me individually for sort of help understanding unemployment benefits and how they've changed, or sort of resources available in the community, that's where I feel like I've been able to be really effective in helping people
Hmm.
find their way through this time of uncertainty. That was a lot of talking.
No, thank you, Emily. Thank you. I think that was a lot of important talking. Um, I have a similar struggle, and timing for me has become really crucial, because
Yeah.
one thing we're doing, of course, at the Commons is online. We're having a running story, what we call a running story. And as information comes in, basically it just gets added to the top of this internet story. So the fresh information's always on top, and it just bumps down the other
Hmm.
information. And there's editing as Randy's basically taken control of that. But for me, it's like, okay, so I'm working on it's Monday, I'm working on an article. By Tuesday, when we're supposed to go to press, that information may or may not still be relevant.
Hmm.
And so how do I find the pieces that are relevant and concrete, that can last a longer time?
Yes.
And that's what I've been really struggling with, since we're a weekly paper as well as the online.
Well, that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the pieces that I've really enjoyed that I've seen in this is really about like what we learn about human nature from these times, what we
Yeah.
learn about the cracks in our system that we were sort of aware of and that have widened in this time. Um, what are sort of lessons for the future that we're experiencing that we want to make sure that we hold on to and don't just sort of like leave in plague times, but carry into non-plague times. And I
Mm-hmm.
feel like that's the lasting information is um, the humanity and the sort of policy implications of it all. Because all the rest, like the up-to-date information, blah, 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 that can all be found at like, the 6 relevant links that I think everyone's using, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. But it's the long-term implications. And I think also what I'm sitting with is just, and I'm watching this in my friends and family as well, is just, um, I don't think a lot of people were prepared for the sense of grief.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because this grief has happened in such a short period of time. Like last week was a whole other world.
Yeah.
And the week before that was an even different world.
Hmm.
And a month ago, not even thinking about that. Um, and so I find with a lot of my friends and family just sitting with that uncertainty and also that grief of what's happening, what's not happening, what they've lost, what they haven't lost. Um, it's really interesting.
It is, and it's hard to grieve what we don't even know yet, too, even though it feels so present.
Mm-hmm.
It's like grieving for an unknown future, and the future is always unknown, right?
Right.
But it's like all of these like very true things about life have become so much crisper right now.
Mm-hmm.
We don't ever know what the future holds. Things are always uncertain. Relationships are always precious and fleeting. So yeah, it's really hard, and it's hard for me to sit with the grief of the interconnectedness of our life on Earth. I don't know how to say that in a less whooshy way. Yeah, I mean, I remember like the Australian wildfires and sort of thinking about the death of all of those animals and how like if you could sit into that for a second, how painful it could be. But
Mm-hmm.
I am not capable of holding the grief of the world right now. And what I see and I love and I don't really have the capacity for is the people who are really spending these moments highlighting the beauty that they're finding in the
Mm-hmm.
cracks. Um, you know, like the swans on the that have come back to Venice. I don't know if you've seen that.
I have
So
not.
the
Oh, wow.
canals in Venice are clean for the first time in like probably 1,000 years. And they have like, you know, wildlife is coming back to them in this very like what every apocalypse novel ever
Mm-hmm.
has, right? Um, and so, you know, or the singing from the balconies in Italy. I don't know why all the beauty is in Italy. I'm sure there's beauty in China. We're just not getting coverage of it.
Right.
And then so I'm like so struck by that and so called towards that. And yet I'm so aware of like most of the people who are able to post, um, at least in my universe, about the beauty that they're finding are folks who like feel relatively economically secure through this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that is key. I have to say, it was quite a moment for me. Emily and I were both on a call, a Zoom call yesterday with the BDCC. For those who don't know, the Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation. Basically, it's a group of business people talking about what do businesses need, what do we need economically. And Congressman Peter Welch was on. Welch, I always get that wrong.
Yeah,
There,
yeah, you don't.
um, was on the call, and it was both scary but comforting to hear him say at one point, look, the way we know the way to contain this virus is to shut down the economy. And
Hmm.
that's the dilemma we're dealing with. But
Hmm.
just to hear someone outside Vermont say, yes, we have shut down the economy, it's like, okay, we really are all in this together.
Hmm.
It was scary but comforting at the same time.
Yeah, and it, you know, highlights the existing weaknesses or tension points, I guess, in our own economy in Vermont.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of us felt like we weren't going to be affected particularly by this virus because we're so rural, sparsely populated. People tend to like hiding in their houses anyway. So that, you know, I think that sort of created a little bit of a Vermont exceptionalism in the weeks leading up to this,
Mm-hmm.
which we, you know, are prone to. And then, you know, the incredible emphasis on our tourism and hospitality economy,
Right.
right? Which is really, you know, an incredible source of income for so many people. I think is one of the reasons that Vermont has been able to maintain its beauty. Why, you know, so many of our sort of really high-end value-added agriculture products have been able to thrive in such a small economy is because of tourism.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, you know, it's the first economy, it's the first part of our economy that's really suffered a significant hit here and will is going to have a enormous amount of trouble rebuilding. And
Yes.
so, Olga, do you want to do anything to silence your telephone?
Um, it's my father.
Oh, should we pause while you?
We're going to pause because he
Okay,
rarely calls me.
okay.
Hey, Dad.
Oh, wait, we're not pausing. Mute yourself, Olga. I can mute you. There we go.
Thank you for that quick interruption of my phone. It shows that the coronavirus doesn't stop even for radio shows. So thank you for that brief interruption. All
Absolutely.
is well. So Emily, I'm sorry, you were talking about the cracks in our system and the pressures on our economy and tourist industry.
Yeah, and that so we can, you know, the existing weaknesses that were sort of weaknesses or cracks, you know, a month ago are widening, as I said. And so really, you know, concerned about all the folks that work in hospitality, some of them with very small businesses, some of them much larger businesses, the people who work in all of those businesses who most of them, you know, tipped workers, which we've talked about, you know, the challenges of being a tipped worker
Mm-hmm.
on many of our other shows together. Um, you know, we're the first to really experience the economic impacts of this and will probably be the folks who experience it for the longest.
Yeah.
And so that's scary. And I think that's scary for a lot of people. And so Yeah, would love to talk about sort of what we're looking at in terms of how we can support those people through this process.
That would be great, because one thing I have to give the legislature credit for is I feel that you all jumped on this really quickly, and you tried to find the cracks in the system that were going to get hit the worst.
Mhm.
Um, and so the legislature is basically recessed.
No, actually, it's like it's weirder than that.
Okay,
Um,
good.
yeah.
Why not?
So what is happening is last week. What day is it? Today is Friday.
Mhm.
Last Thursday, basically, we realized that stuff was getting significantly worse. And so two House committees really put aside the work that they were doing in the face of crossover, which was last week. And so for folks who don't know, crossover is the point in the legislative session where any bill that needs to move from the House to the Senate has to sort of be voted out of the House and move over, and vice versa. Um, and the second half of the biennium, which is this year, that's even more significant a deadline because you don't have like the other year to finish it up and send it over. And so things during crossover are like a harried, extremist, neurotic, elevated mess under the best of circumstances. And so that was no exception. And my committee and all the other committees were sort of pumping through legislation they'd been working on for a while to try to finish it up and get it voted out. We were sort of going through, 20 bills at a time on the House floor to move them over to the Senate. Um, all the lobbyists get really elevated because they know that their bill's about to die or not. Information changes really rapidly. And the pitch in the State House with so many people so close together and all their feelings is really, 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 really intense. And then, so we're layering on to that existing experience, a pandemic.
Just for
And
fun.
just for fun. And like we are so close to each other's faces all the time and like touch so much stuff all the time. And even without a pandemic, like everyone's always exchanging like terrible diseases with each other. And it's just like a really gross place when you like think about the microbial experience of it all, which I generally try not to
Just
and
don't.
now have been. So anyway, in the midst of all of that, a few committees under instructions from the speaker um, really put aside our existing work, got permission to miss the crossover deadline and to sort of have a later crossover deadline, and focused on sort of COVID-19 emergency packages. And so that
Mhm.
was the healthcare committee put together a really comprehensive bill, and then my committee, the Commerce and Economic Development Committee, put together a fairly comprehensive bill that we on Friday voted out of the House, along with like a million other little we passed this bill about migratory birds really, really quickly too. Like that was sort of, it was this funny balance of like, well, we should get everything off the calendar that's on the calendar. And so debate on things that normally would have had like hours of debate were like, no questions at all. So I'm a little nervous about some of the stuff that might have passed. But the COVID-19 bills were fabulous. And then House General also worked on a package that isn't ready yet, but I can sort of talk about some of the details of that too. So the Healthcare Committee passed a bunch of measures really sort of focusing on loosening requirements to get into the workforce because we
Mhm.
have a healthcare workforce shortage best of times. And if we have a greater need for healthcare workers and we have the possibility that healthcare workers are going to get sick themselves, we really need to be able to bring more people into that workforce. So loosen some licensing regulations, really sort of like across the board, and not just in the healthcare workforce, and a few other sort of places in the workforce like childcare, I think.
Mhm.
And so did that, and then some telemedicine work that we'd actually passed a few days before that they'd been working on for a long time. And so really tried to get the healthcare system ready for what's coming.
Mhm.
And then my committee did a really deep dive into changes in the unemployment system that we would
Right.
need to make this work. And so I'll get into that in detail in just a second. Um, and so we passed those all on Friday, and then we, understanding that the Senate was not going to be able to pick it up immediately, but so that it would be ready for them when they were ready for it. And because, so then we recessed. This last week, the House has been in recess, but the
Mm-hmm.
Senate committees have started meeting virtually.
Okay.
And the Senate is a much smaller body, and their
Right.
committees are much smaller. And so it's much easier for all of them to get together and not have the majority of people's mics muted, and have a sort of functioning system. They're
Interesting.
also able to get into a space, if they do need to vote as a body, they have a much smaller quorum requirement
Mm-hmm.
and could find a space where they can engage in social distancing appropriately while doing that. No one can figure out how to do that on the House side yet. And so that's sort of what the House is working on, all the technology solutions to how many of us there are, while the Senate is sort of continuing on in committee.
Mm-hmm.
Through this time, the Joint Rules Committee, which is a few members of the House and a few members of the Senate, sort of majority leader, speaker, pro tem, minority leader, assistant majority leaders. The Joint Rules Committee has been meeting every day at 4:00 and hearing briefings from the administration. And anyone in the public can call into those calls. And they're
Oh,
really
really?
interesting. Yes. And then the Senate committee that's been meeting this week, those are all also available for anyone in the public to call into. And so that's how the, public notice, public participation requirements, all of that, we need to maintain that while we're doing the people's work, right?
Yeah.
And so that's been happening through this time. The rules calls are really interesting, and they're at 4:00 every day. And it's briefings from commissioners and secretaries about sort of specific issues in the specific issues of government that are under stress right now. And we want to make sure get all the support they
Where
need.
can someone find that call-in number?
I think Vermont Digger posts the legislative schedule every day, as well as all of the call-in numbers for everything.
Okay.
But I can also add a link to wherever we post this.
Okay.
I'm going to pause this for a second. Have you seen the funny memes about people describing their like pets and family as coworkers, and the funny things that their pets and family do as coworkers?
I have
Oh,
not.
they're pretty good. They're
Oh, I
pretty good.
must.
Yeah. So that's how people can participate. And so the Senate is moving along those two, the healthcare bill and the economic development bill.
Mm-hmm.
And I think is planning on voting it out early next week. And then the House is going to reconvene a few specific committees next week using the same sort of format. And so we can
Okay.
continue sort of doing the emergency work that we need to do, while we figure out technology solutions for sort of the larger work of the legislature.
Mm-hmm. So what are, amongst all this emergency response in the legislature, there's also some big bills that the legislature definitely has to do each year, mainly the budget.
Yeah,
Um, it sounds like that is still in the mix, but hasn't been approved.
that's still all in the mix. So the transportation bill passed the House already. So
Okay.
that's great. And then the budget and the revenue bills, are also the budget last week, when the Appropriations Committee was still meeting in real life. They sort of got clear on what the bill would look like if they had no more time versus what they would still want to work on. And so they prepared themselves for an eventuality where we needed to move really fast if needed. And the revenue bills are sort of in the same, there's a few different revenue bills, but they're doing the same thing. And both of those committees are meeting virtually starting next week.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that everyone's aware that like those are sort of must pass bills, and those are moving forward as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that update, Emily. I
Mm-hmm.
think we will want to go into some of the details
Mm-hmm.
in those bills and the tools that people have access to. But just for the purpose of the audio recording, we
Yes.
need to hear from some of our underwriters.
Oh, fabulous. Let us hear
Yes.
from those underwriters.
They are
Can we
important
play the
because
co-op underwriter today? Because I feel like the co-op's been doing a lot to step up on this, and I would like to give them a little shout out.
I will definitely play the co-op
Also,
underwriters.
it's Ruth's voice, and you know how I feel about Ruth's voice. So
It's very
soothing.
soothing.
So soothing.
Yes. So stay tuned, folks. We will be right back after a word from our sponsors. 3, 2, 1. We are back with the Montpelier Happy Hour here on Zoom, the internet, as well as WVEW LP Brattleboro 107.7 FM, your community radio station. I should note for listeners that technically the radio station is closed to the public right now. In fact, it's been shut down, so no DJs are spreading any germs anywhere. And I want to thank all the volunteers and DJs who have stepped up to make sure that we can still get things on air and work remotely. So please tune in to WVEW 107.7 when you have a chance, and give a virtual high five to all the DJs keeping the station going. Emily, let's talk about tools. So if you are one of the people who are out there facing unemployment right now, or even just worried that it could happen, what tools are in place for you?
So unemployment eligibility is significantly expanded under these times. So that means that if you leave work because you are caring for a loved one who is either medically vulnerable or sick, you are eligible for unemployment. If you are leaving work because you are caring for your children, you are eligible for unemployment. If you leave work because your business experienced a slowdown, you're eligible for unemployment. If you leave work because your business experienced a shutdown, you're eligible for unemployment. Whether that was because of sort of like normal economic reasons, because business slowed so much because of COVID that layoffs were required, or if the government ordered a shutdown of where you work, also eligible for unemployment. Unemployment is not the full amount that someone normally gets. It's a reduced amount of their income. And there's also a rules change that allows employers, if they're able to or willing to, and you know, this is at the discretion of employers, to supplement the unemployment earnings to bring someone back up to their regular salary, which is not at all allowable under normal rules.
Right, right.
In addition, people are not required to engage in a work search or be able and ready to go back to work or have a clear end date. So there's a certain category of sort of seasonal layoffs normally that people can be exempt from the job searching if there's a return to work date. But under these circumstances, a return to work date is not required. And
Okay.
so that is a really significant social safety net for people who have employers.
Mm-hmm.
And really encourage everyone to apply. Because we had such low unemployment right before this happened, the call center staff at the Department of Labor was at a pretty skeleton crew because they didn't have a lot of calls to answer. And
Good
so
point.
for the first few days, there was a lot of challenges with people on hold for significant periods of time. They've seen 1,000% increase and 4,000 submissions over the course of the week. And so,
Wow.
yeah, it's pretty huge. And so they have significantly staffed up already, as well as having everyone at the Department of Labor move into doing this work.
Mm-hmm.
So people who were, you know, helping people look for jobs or doing like workforce development or whatever it is, they're all on the call lines now.
Okay.
But they all had to be trained to be on the call lines. And so that's really improved significantly. And then really remarkably quick action on IT staff's part. And like, you know, I think we all like don't give IT staff enough credit under normal circumstances.
Yeah,
It's
we
like
don't.
they're kind of dorky and annoying, and they like always say weird stuff and like whatever. But like, there's a lot of IT staff saving the day lately.
Mm-hmm.
Healthcare workers also, healthcare workers, childcare workers, IT staff, grocery staff, cleaning staff, heroes of the pandemic.
Yes.
Um, so they also have an online form now, which will help tremendously. And so that's available for anyone who is employed by an employer, whether that's a nonprofit, a for-profit, et cetera.
Okay.
And on the employer side, the bill that's in the House, that left the House and is in the Senate right now, would make sure that employers' experience rating is not affected by that change. So
I'm
employers,
sorry, could you repeat that? You
yeah,
froze for a second, Emily.
I wondered if I froze for a second. I've been trying to get through to Fairpoint, or what's it called, Consolidated Communications, to update my bandwidth. And I can't seem to get through to them, but I really need a little more internet if I'm going to be governing from home.
Yeah, we all need to borrow some cup of internets.
Yes. So employers' experience rating will not, if when this passes the Senate and the governor signs it into law, which all signs point to yes, employers' experience rating is not affected by these layoffs and these unemployment approvals. And so the way, this is like so technical, but that's, I guess, what we do here. The way employers pay for unemployment insurance on each of their employees is calculated. There's a percentage of their total payroll that's calculated based on their past history of layoffs.
Right.
So an employer is considered sort of higher risk if they've had a lot of layoffs.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some challenges with that also under best of circumstances around sort of smaller employers tend to feel a bigger impact from single layoffs, but this bill would basically hold everyone at whatever experience rating they were before this all happened. So
Good.
employers don't have a disincentive to let people leave work to keep themselves and their communities healthy. So it's sort of like a public health response to helping employers be responsible that way. And so that feels like a really important social safety net. The bill that passed federal Congress and the president signed into law yesterday,
I
maybe
believe
before that,
so.
very recently, also has a lot of provisions around unemployment, which means that we will have a lot of federal relief, meaning federal money going into our unemployment trust fund, which usually is just built out of that money that gets paid in. It's an insurance plan, essentially. And the money that's in it is just sort of a pool of money from what employers have paid into it in the past. And while it is quite robust, and we got a briefing on sort of how robust it is on Friday before we left the legislature, certainly more money flowing into that is very needed right now. So that's really good. There was also pieces of the federal legislation that passed that gives sick and family leave to employees, but the details of that I'm not entirely clear on yet, because they seem to be sort of stacked, and it's not clear what has to come from employers and what is from federal money, and how that's actually supposed to be carried out or implemented at the state level. I know that in Vermont, if that money is going to have to come from employers who are already really economically stretched by these shutdowns, that's going to be fairly problematic. We have very few large corporate employers here,
True.
which changes all of our legislation around workers' rights, and really is, as we've talked about before, a real reason why we need sort of more centralized government-run public benefits programs, because employers don't have the capacity to carry out those kinds of benefits in a way that large corporate employers in other parts of the country do. So as I sort of have the chance to unpack and understand the levels of that legislation better, I will get back on the Zoom with you and tell our listeners about that. But the unemployment is really available. If anyone wants to sort of talk through that with me, I'm very happy to. Certain business owners have structured their small businesses so that they're employees of their small businesses. And
Hmm.
those folks are also eligible for unemployment.
Okay.
If you are a small business owner or a self-employed person who has structured yourself as an LLC, and you are, then you're eligible for sort of the small business assistance that's happening.
Okay.
So those are sort of two categories. And then there's a third category of folks who are self-employed and are just doing 1099s.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a lot of Vermonters as well.
Yep.
And for those folks, unemployment benefits will be available if the president signs a particular type of disaster relief.
Oh.
And we had that under Irene, actually. And that's called, it's disaster unemployment something. It's called DUA. And so I'm working really closely with my House committee to make sure our congressional delegation understands the need for us in Vermont in particular to have that designation so that our unemployment benefits can cover all of these folks who are self-employed.
Mm-hmm. Now, Windham County specifically, and Bennington County, and I think Windsor County, because we border New Hampshire and Massachusetts, who have already received a certain type of emergency declaration, we are also eligible for some of those declarations. Do you know anything about that?
So those declarations are specific to the Small Business Administration.
Okay.
And they're incredibly helpful. And that's really sort of a flood of money to support small businesses, mostly with loans. And so we have a whole package of that. Part of that was legislation that the House committee considered last Friday and is sitting in the Senate with the Vermont Economic Development Authority, VEDA, which we don't talk about all that much under normal circumstances, but is one of sort of the major lending institutions in Vermont that props up specific industries or supports specific industries. They have a huge farm portfolio. They have a big hospitality portfolio, and we really look to them when we want to support a particular sector. And they do that through really low interest loans, often and have a higher appetite for risk in those industries than a regular banking institution would. And often the legislature will sort of buy down the risk with VEDA for those industries. And so VEDA is looking at a package of small business loans. Did I freeze and now I'm back?
Nope, you're good. You're good.
VEDA is looking at a package of small business loans that would either be super low, 1% interest or no percent interest for businesses that would be eligible for loans. And then people could then pay interest only for quite a period of time until they were ready to repay the loan. And they're already doing that on folks who are in their existing loan portfolio, which is a lot of Vermont businesses and farms. And then are looking to expand with a little bit of an appropriation from the legislature, that same lending to more institutions. The SBA declaration, Small Business Administration declaration, sort of brings more money into the state to do essentially that same thing.
Okay.
The problem that we see in Vermont, especially in Brattleboro, is that many of our businesses are not eligible for loans or not interested in loans because they're fairly clear with themselves that they're not going to ever have the capacity to pay back that loan.
Yeah.
And so in that case, what we really need is straight grants or other forms of relief. And that's something that I think, came up on that call with BDCC and Congressman Welch yesterday. And something that we're really looking at is sort of what is the relief package for some of these really small employers that we know won't be back after this if we don't figure something out. Okay. The other thing there's a few other things sort of related to economic uncertainty that I wanted to highlight for people.
Before you do that, Emily, I have one more question about employees.
Oh, please.
And I don't know if you know the answer to this, but if you are someone whose health insurance is tied to your employer,
yes,
and you are laid off,
yes,
can you go right into the exchange?
So the I think most people know that there's sort of like enrollment periods for health insurance, and
Mm-hmm.
that's, in the fall, right before, the late fall is when that sort of open enrollment period is for health insurance. Under any circumstances throughout the year, even when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, if you have a change in circumstance, which a layoff is, you are eligible to go back into open enrollment. Um,
Great.
and so the exchange is there and available. And if someone has no income, then they would be eligible for Medicaid, which is the best health insurance I've ever been on personally.
Mm-hmm.
And
Same
anyone
here.
I know who's ever been on Medicaid thinks that too. It's incredibly comprehensive.
Great. And for
Yeah.
those who don't know, the exchange is also the name for Vermont Health Connect.
Oh, thanks.
So you
Good
can go up to
translating.
you can find that information
Um,
on through the Vermont Department of Health, but
no, it's
also,
actually, is it the Vermont Department of Health? It's the Vermont Department of Health Access, which is actually a
there we go.
totally different, which is part of the Agency of Human Services. And anyway, if you just like the smallest bit of Googling, well, you will find your way towards the health exchange.
You will.
And if you can't find it, email me or call and I'll send you a link.
Thank you.
Yeah. And so that's how that's working. And I actually
Good.
haven't heard of any challenges with call volume there, interestingly.
Fantastic. Because the
Yeah,
one thing we do not want people to not have right now in the middle of a pandemic is health insurance.
absolutely. And one of the sort of 4 federal packages that is coming, and I think this first one, but again, I haven't had time to dive into the details of that and digest it, is sort of expansion of what we can use Medicaid funds for.
Great.
Yes. So further, other sort of pieces of economic uncertainty that I think are really important to highlight. So a pause on evictions and foreclosures requires an act of the legislature. And while
Mm-hmm.
there is legislation that is being drafted about that, that would take a while, and is a fairly complicated thing to pass because many folks in Vermont specifically who own and rent homes couldn't necessarily pay their mortgage if someone wasn't paying rent.
Mm-hmm.
And so that needs to sort of get solved before something like that could pass. However, there's a lot of rules changes that have taken place that are going to make it impossible for anyone to foreclose or evict right now. And so I want to sort of talk people through that. Both the Department of Financial Regulation in Vermont and sort of the federal department of that have advised the banking and insurance industry to work with their customers
Mm-hmm.
around debt. And so if someone is having any trouble paying any of their loans, whether that's a car loan or a home loan or whatever else, and their bank isn't willing to work with them in a very significant way on that, please be in touch with your legislator, with the Department of Financial Regulation, to lodge a complaint about that, because that is really something that is being asked of the industry in a quite stern way right now. And it's
Mm-hmm.
something that the banking industry is actually in the banking industry's best interest to be doing that right now, to
Yeah.
sort of keep the economy stable.
Does that also include credit cards?
Credit cards, yes, it does include credit cards. Vermont has much less control over that industry because we don't have sort of any of the big banks, big credit card companies within our borders. But yes,
Mm-hmm.
it absolutely includes that. And so that's a really important thing for people to be aware of. Also, and I don't have my notes for all the details of this in front of me, but the court system is also on a significant slowdown right now. And both eviction and foreclosure proceedings need to go through the court system,
Mm-hmm.
and they will not be taking up any of those hearings
Okay.
for the foreseeable future.
Yes.
So there's no actual way to do those things, even if someone wanted to.
That's a true halt right there.
Yes. And so there's a lot of like interesting pieces of where power sits that are being illuminated through this process. So
Yeah.
there's been a lot of questions about taxes and taxes due and sort of fees due. And while the legislature needs to make a decision about changing deadlines on things, so changing the deadlines on when taxes are due, changing the deadlines on when a dog license fee is due, all of those things, well,
Mm-hmm.
that requires an act of the legislature. The fines that are tied to a late payment on those things is actually in rules. So an administrative body, the Department of Taxes or the Department of Financial Regulation, is who can levy or not levy those fees.
Uh-huh.
And so we can say, yes, the deadline's not moving, but there's no penalty for not paying. And so there's a bunch of places like that, like, no, we can't say there are no evictions, but we're not going to do anything about evictions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the
Mm-hmm.
interesting balance that's been that I've been sort of taking as one of those lessons of my understanding of cracks and opportunities in government that I'm hoping to carry into a post-pandemic future.
Fascinating.
Yes.
Great.
The last, never should say last. Um,
In a shifting situation.
in a very shifting situation, two other things I just want to highlight is around childcare access and food access, which
Mm.
are really important issues around people who are, struggling financially, or people who are just struggling through this because it is crazy times. And so childcare has now been limited to people who are essential workers. I think it's important that people understand that the definition of essential workers is quite broad. It is not, normally when we think about essential workers, we think about emergency personnel,
Mm-hmm.
and that is not what the definition of essential worker looks like, meaning essential workers who are eligible for childcare during shutdowns in childcare and school. And so that includes people who work in grocery stores, people who work for state government doing benefits provision, people who, healthcare workers, custodial staff, and emergency personnel. And if people think that they need to be on this list and aren't, it's a rapidly evolving list. So please lodge your complaint if you're not on the list and you think that you are an essential worker and require childcare right now. And so the childcare for that is being coordinated between the Child Development Division, Let's Grow Kids, and the school systems. And there's sort of surveys out for if you need childcare during this time, you put your information in the survey, and then the resource and referral and schools in each community will be creating systems rapidly for people to get their children in childcare for that time. Also, people whose kids are in childcare, sort of the under 5 non-public education set, whose childcare centers are shut down, are being asked to still pay for their childcare while they're shut down,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't want our childcare centers to go under during this time, because it's already an incredibly fragile system.
Mm-hmm.
If that is a financial hardship for people, there is a whole other system in place to fix that. So that's another place where if things feel complicated or like they're not working, reach out, because I've been really impressed with how much we've all come together to sort of see the problem, identify the problem, fix the problem, communicate the fix to the problem. But there's so much information out there that often the communication of the fix to the problem gets lost in the morass of CDC updates. So
Mm-hmm.
just want to name that. And then food access. Groundworks in our community, and many other food shelves around the state, but Groundworks in our community is doing deliveries from their food shelf. And you don't have to be an existing client of Groundworks to be eligible for that. You just need to be in financial need, which many of us
Mm-hmm.
are that weren't before. And so they're doing deliveries from the food shelf, and you just call Groundworks and ask for that. And then the schools are using the school bus routes to deliver bagged breakfasts and lunches and snacks to children all throughout the school district.
Yeah.
And so that is, and that's also available for anyone under the age of 18. They don't have to have been enrolled in school. They can be 2 years old. They can be homeschooled, whatever it is. And there's a little web form and a schedule of the school bus stops available on the school district's website too.
And let's not forget as well that if you are hungry and you are eligible, you can still sign up for Three Squares Vermont, which is Vermont's version of what has commonly been known as the food stamp program. So
Yes,
you can supplement your food budget that way as well. And Hunger Free
absolutely.
Vermont has a lot of great resources on how to apply, and Groundworks can help. I mean, there's a lot of organizations who can help you apply for that if you need help.
Absolutely. Thank you. And then senior meals have sort of switched the way they do their work to a delivery model too. So if you're in that over 65 category, that's available for you too.
Great.
Yes. Whew, so much happening.
And now we breathe
Yeah.
and we pause.
One of the places of both one of those sort of cracks that's been widened and exposed, and then that beauty is sort of within that I've found through this process is volunteerism. And
Yes.
so Meals on Wheels and Groundworks and all of our sort of community helping agencies, generally most of their volunteer capacity is folks who are over 65.
Hmm.
And that's something that we've known about our community for quite a while, and there's been sort of a push to bring younger volunteers in, but has been a struggle. And so in these times, however, we don't want medically vulnerable people driving around delivering things and being out in the community. You know, we want folks to stay home and stay safe. And
Yes.
so really need to rapidly transition that volunteer workforce, right?
Hmm.
And it's been really incredible to see that a few folks in our community have stepped up to organize all those volunteers. Jen Jacobs, Erin O'Keefe, Carrie Seacrest, and Angela Earl Gray have all sort of stepped up to organize. I think Jen Jacobs is sort of like one of the leads on it. And they've been doing some really cool work with a web form that anyone who wants to volunteer in the community fills out this form. Someone calls them that day and says, hey, who are you? What are you interested in? Thanks for reaching out. And then they get assigned to an agency that really has a need for volunteers right now. And right now we have more volunteers than we have need. And that's like the best place to be.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's really great. And so that makes me feel like incredible about my community. And I hope that that's something that will carry over into sort of the post-pandemic future again.
Yes. Now, the United Way of Windham County also has a form on its website for organizations and volunteers to kind of match up as well, right?
They do as well. A lot of agencies haven't been using that for a while, and the
Okay.
capacity to sort of fill in that web form to update their needs. A lot of organizations don't have the capacity to do that right now, given all the rest that they're doing. And so we have sort of these two parallel, like formal and informal tracks, and people are using both as they feel able and nimble to do so.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we are looking at the clock just about out of time. But before we go, Emily, I just wanted to check in with you and see what are you doing to take care of yourself during this time of transition and uncertainty?
Well, I brought my whole teapot to my desk today instead of just a cup.
Very nice. And that's a very pretty green teapot too.
Thank you. My family bought it for me a few years
Oh,
ago for my birthday. Um, so I've been doing that. I made a funny list for myself, um, which I will grab, which includes like reminders about self-care or caring for myself on it, that I've been looking at regularly.
nice.
One of them includes just eat a green vegetable, which is something like under normal circumstances, I don't really need a reminder to do. I am like an adult who likes eating healthy. But so I've
Craving
been,
comfort food.
yes, that's part of it, is that like there was like a lot of toast and desires for pasta. I did, yeah. So anyway, so really like being super clear with myself about what I need to do, which is not what I always do. And like
Hmm.
naming the things I need. And so green vegetable, go for a walk. I've been having some really fun Zoom dates with friends. Um, when I normally would not do that at all. And so like connecting with friends who live out of town that I don't normally talk to that much. And so that's been really, really nice. Trying to do more dance parties, but that's like right now sitting in intention rather than reality. But
Okay.
listening to different music than I usually listen to.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because, you know, well, every mood requires a different kind of music.
Mm-hmm.
And then while I'm on conference calls that have a lot of people on them and I'm sort of muted for the majority of the conference call anyway, really trying to move my body during that time. So as I get dressed in the morning, thinking about like, does my clothing have a pocket that I can tuck my phone into so I can be, you know, walking around the house, whether that's like vacuuming or stretching or just like being in movement while I am still working, because it's really been like back-to-back video
Yeah.
and voice calls for like 12 hours a day since
Yep.
this started. Yeah.
Good
How about
list.
you?
Some of the same things. One of the things on my to-do list today is to sit down and say, okay, where can I fit in creative time? Because one thing that makes me really happy is getting to do, you've seen my little crafts, you've seen all my little crafts.
Yes.
So do my crafting, do my creative work, do some creative writing, and make sure I actually make time for that so it doesn't
Yes.
get swallowed up by the craziness of everything. Um, I've also very consciously shifted the type of TV and movie I'm watching right now,
Oh,
because I tend to be someone who really likes mysteries and whodunits and police
and
procedurals, but also
adrenaline.
those yang action movies. I love
Yeah.
those too,
Huh.
and my sci-fi. And they're fun. And with the mystery genre, it is about what happens when the world has been broken apart and how do you put it back together.
Mm-hmm.
So I will keep some mysteries, but I've also very consciously put in a lot of comedies.
Mm-hmm.
And even I don't tend to be a romance watcher,
Mm-hmm.
but I've consciously, things that are focused on relationships,
Mm-hmm.
I've consciously moved them into my queue as well to
May I
make
make
sure
a
that I'm laugh.
recommendation?
Um,
No, can I make a recommendation to
oh
you
yes,
in a
please
category?
do.
Call the Midwife if you have not seen it.
Oh, I love Call the
There
Midwife.
are so many seasons.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Yes,
really hard to run out. I mean, I did run out, but it's really hard. And so, if you have not watched that recently, it's a story of such beauty and resiliency, and relationships, and so it feels very appropriate for this time.
yes.
Do you have a
Thank you.
recommendation about your media and or crafting?
I am still discovering things, but one um, show on Netflix that is crossing that border of keeping my mysteries, but also having some comedy is The Good Cop, or A
Oh,
Good Cop, on Netflix,
okay.
which is about a father and son learning to work together after the father, who was a really well-known detective who went bad, is out of
Mm.
prison, and the
Oh,
son is like not going to be like his dad, and so he's this straight-laced, by the book cop, and it's actually quite tender and quite funny at times.
nice.
So that's at least on Netflix, that's my recommendation. I'm still working on the romances. I'm really out of that genre,
Yeah,
so
I don't know. I have intentions of starting watercolor painting, but I've not gotten there yet. I'm going to see if I can. My family are, they're like pretty serious introverts, and so none of this feels like a disruption to them particularly. And so my efforts to like bring them on board with all of my new plans is falling a little flat. And so I'm hoping that maybe today I can engage my son in some watercolor painting. Um, yeah,
Good luck. We'll have to
thank
have a
you.
craft show and tell when
Yes,
the
that sounds
quarantine is
good.
lifted.
Yes.
Well, Emily,
Yes.
as always, so wonderful to have you on the show today.
You too, Olga.
Yeah, it's good to see you. Keep
Hmm.
up. We'll have to do this next week, because as far as we know, we will be on air and on the internet next week as well.
Absolutely. And we have some intentions of doing some shorter episodes in the week ahead so we can sort of um, be on par with some of the speed that things are moving and the need for content from people.
Yeah, just some good short information. This is what
Hmm.
you need to know. This is how you can use it.
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Well, everyone, thank you for tuning in today. We are the Montpelier Happy Hour. You can find us on WVEW 107.7 FM Brattleboro every Friday at 2 p.m. or on the Vermontitude SoundCloud page, the Vermontitude Facebook page, and of course, Emily's.
EmilyKornheiser.org, ekornheiser@gmail.com, ekornheiser@ledge.state.vt.us. And just so everyone who's watching the video knows, I always make this silly dance when I say all the contact points. You can find me on Twitter. My Facebook feed is very filled with resources right now, and I'm also on Instagram, but I'm mostly posting pictures of daffodils and Post-it notes. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and look forward to talking next time.
Looking forward to it.